China has protested the Philippines' claim, before the United Nations Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, for an extended continental shelf in the West Philippine Sea. In a note verbal on June 18 communication, addressed to UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, the permanent mission of the People's Republic of China to the UN, said the Chinese government seriously requests the Commission not to consider the submission by the Philippines.
The Philippines' move infringes on China's sovereign rights and jurisdiction, violates international law including the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and contravenes the relevant provisions of the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. Based on the rules of procedure of the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, if the submission made by the Philippine side involves disputed waters, the Commission shall not consider and determine the submission.
Earlier on June 14, the Philippines makes official submission to the United Nations on entitlements to an extended continental shelf in the West Philippine Sea, up to 350 nautical miles of its baseline in Palawan. The Philippines exercise its sovereign rights under Article 76 of 1982 UN Convention, on which a coastal state could have exclusive rights to exploit resources in its continental shelf, a vast stretch of seabed that can extend up to 350 nautical miles or 648 kilometers, including the right to authorize and regulate any kind of drilling. According to China, the Philippines' claim to a 200 nautical mile extended continental shelf in the West Palawan region is without basis and seriously infringed China's sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction in the South China Sea. China said it has indisputable sovereignty over Nanhai Zhudao and adjacent waters, and enjoys sovereign rights and jurisdiction over the relevant waters as well as the seabed and subsoil thereof. Nanhai Zhudao refers to China's so-called South China Sea islands, its term for four major island chains spread out in the disputed waters, including the Spratly Islands west of Palawan, which is covered by the Philippines' latest extended continental shelf claim. The 2016 arbitral ruling, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, invalidates China's 9 claims and declared its activities in the area as unlawful. The Philippines sought UN recognition of the extended continental margin, citing geological and tectonic data on the Palawan-Mindoro continent and the West Palawan region. The Philippines provided data that the West Palawan region is a natural prolongation of the land territory of the Philippines, that extends beyond 200 nautical miles from the baselines, thus demonstrating that the Philippines is entitled to a continental shelf beyond 200 miles in the West Palawan region, according to the 30-page executive summary of its June 14 partial submission to the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. According to UNCLOS, a country's continental shelf comprises the seabed and subsoil of the submarine areas that extend beyond its territorial sea throughout the natural prolongation of its land territory to the outer edge of the continental margin, or to a distance of 200 nautical miles from the baselines. But the outer edge of the continental shelf should not exceed 350 nautical miles from the baseline. The Philippines has asked a United Nations body to formally recognize the extent of its undersea continental seabed in the West Philippine Sea, where it would have the exclusive right to exploit resources, the Department of Foreign Affairs said, in a move that rejects China's vast territorial claims to the region. The Philippine government, through the Philippine mission to the UN in New York, submitted information to the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf on the extent of its undersea shelf in the South China Sea, off western Palawan province, after more than a decade and a half of scientific research. The submission is a declaration not only of the Philippines' maritime entitlements under UN Convention on the Law of Seas but also of the country's commitment to the responsible application of its processes. The Philippines underscored the significance of the submission in securing the Philippines' sovereign rights in maritime jurisdictions in the West Philippine Sea, noting that the 2016 award on the South China Sea arbitration confirmed the Philippines' maritime entitlements and rejected those that exceeded geographic and substantive limits under UNCLOS. The undersea region where the Philippines seeks to formally establish its sovereign rights under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea or UNCLOS, covers the Spratlys, a chain of islands, islets, reefs and atolls that has been fiercely contested over the years by China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei and Taiwan. The Philippines' undersea continental shelf could potentially overlap with those of other coastal states in the South China Sea, including that of Vietnam. Philippine officials expressed readiness to hold talks to resolve such issues based on UNCLOS. The Philippines makes this partial submission to build confidence and promote international cooperation in the peaceful and amicable resolution of maritime boundary issues. They clarified that its submission was filed without prejudice to similar entitlements in the region by Vietnam and Malaysia, which also filed claims before the UN Commission on the limits of the continental shelf that may overlap with the West Palawan region. The Philippines manifests its willingness to discuss with the relevant states the delimitation of the maritime boundaries. The Philippines requests the Commission to examine its submission concerning the West Palawan region without prejudice to the question of delimitation with opposite or adjacent coastal states. Vietnam said it is also willing to talk to the Philippines about its overlapping claims in the South China Sea. Vietnam once again affirms its sovereignty over the Hoang Sa and Trong Sa archipelagos in accordance with international law, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Pham Tu Hang said in a statement posted on a government website. Hang was referring to Vietnam's names for the Paracel and Spratly Islands. The continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles as contained in the aforementioned submission by the Philippines has seriously infringed China's sovereignty, sovereign rights and jurisdiction in the South China Sea. In accordance with Article 5A of Annex 1, to the Rules of Procedure of the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, the Chinese government seriously requests the Commission not to consider the submission by the Philippines. In its newest filing on June 14 in New York before the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, the Philippines, on the basis of hydrographic, geological, geophysical and tectonic data and information in the West Palawan region in the West Philippine Sea, pointed out the existence of a Palawan-Mindoro microcontinent, which is a distinct geological and geomorphological unit which includes among others, the Palawan mainland and Calayan Island group. This marked the second submission of the Philippines on an extended continental shelf entitlement. The first submission was in 2009 related to Philippine Rise, then called Benham Rise, an area near the province of Aurora that's bigger than Luzon. In 2012, the UN body confirmed that it's part of the Philippines continental shelf and territory. Maritime law expert and retired Supreme Court Senior Associate Justice Antonio Carpio advised the Philippine government to accept the standing invitation of Vietnam and Malaysia to submit their overlapping extended continental shelf claims in the southern area of the South China Sea to voluntary arbitration under UNCLOS. The Philippines should invite China to join in the voluntary arbitration if China believes it has a claim over the same area. This will ensure a peaceful settlement of the maritime dispute in accordance with the UN Charter and UNCLOS. Philippine Permanent Representative to the UN Antonio Lagdamio said the move can reinvigorate efforts of states to demonstrate their readiness to pursue the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea or UNCLOS processes in the determination of maritime entitlements and promote a rules-based international order. Incidents in the waters tend to overshadow the importance of what lies beneath. The seabed and the subsoil extending from the Philippines archipelago, up to the maximum extent allowed by UNCLOS, hold significant potential resources that will benefit the nation and their people for generations to come. Hostilities and tensions in the disputed waters have alarmingly escalated, particularly between China and the Philippines over two disputed shoals since last year. Chinese Coast Guard ships and suspected militia vessels have used powerful water cannons and dangerous blocking maneuvers against Philippine Coast Guard patrol ships and Navy boats that have injured Filipino personnel, damaged their supply boats and strained diplomatic relations between the two countries. In response to brutal act of Chinese Coast Guard on June 17, President Marcos said the Philippines won't be intimidated, but won't start war amid row with China.
We are not in the business to instigate wars. Our great ambition is to provide a peaceful and prosperous life for every Filipino. This is the drumbeat. This is the principle that we live by and that we march by. We refuse to play by the rules that force us to choose sides in a great power competition. No government that truly exists in the service of the people will invite danger or harm to lives and livelihood.
The Philippines is in favor of peaceful resolution but refuses to be intimidated after a navy clash with China. In defending the nation, the Philippines stay true to its Filipino nature that they would like to settle all these issues peacefully, Marcos said in a speech during a Sunday visit to the headquarters of the Philippine Western Command on Palawan Island. The violent clash which took place last week, near 2nd Thomas Shoal, about 120 miles from Palawan and more than 621 miles from China's nearest major landmass, saw Chinese forces injuring Filipino Navy personnel and damaging at least 2 military boats with machetes, axes and hammers in the disputed South China Sea. This was the latest and most serious incident in a series of escalating confrontations between Chinese and Philippine ships in recent months, as Beijing steps up efforts to push its claims to nearly all of the strategically located waterway. The incident led to condemnation and alarm from the United States, the European Union, Japan, Australia and other Western and Asian nations, while China and the Philippines blamed each other for instigating it and heightening concern that the U.S., which has a mutual defense pact with Manila, may get dragged into the dispute. The Philippine government said it did not consider last week's clash as an armed attack that would trigger a provision in the treaty for Washington to come to Manila's aid. However, it also said it was concerned Chinese forces would launch a similar attempt to dislodge a small Philippine military garrison on 2nd Thomas Shoal. The Philippines said Friday it has no plan to invoke its mutual defense treaty with the United States, after the Chinese Coast Guard reportedly rammed, boarded and used machetes and axes to damage 2 Philippine Navy boats, in a chaotic face-off that injured Filipino Navy personnel at a disputed shoal in the South China Sea. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s key advisors made the remarks in a televised news conference, squelching speculation that Manila might consider invoking the 1951 treaty to secure U.S. military help after last week's confrontation at 2nd Thomas Shoal, where the Chinese Coast Guard also seized Philippine Navy rifles.
This was probably a misunderstanding or an accident. We are not yet ready to classify this as an armed attack. I don't know kung yung mga nakita namin is mga bolo, axe, nothing beyond that.
The Philippine military chief condemned the incident, likening it to an act of piracy, and demanded that China return the rifles and pay for the damage.
They got our equipment. We are demanding that the Chinese return our rifles and our equipment. No? And we are also demanding from them to pay for the damages that they have caused. No?
The territorial disputes, which involve China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei and Taiwan, have long been seen as an Asian flashpoint that could pit the U.S. against China if the high seas confrontations escalate into an armed conflict. Washington has repeatedly warned that it's obligated to help defend the Philippines, its oldest treaty ally in Asia, if Filipino forces, ships and aircraft come under an armed attack, including in the South China Sea. Professor J. Batangbacao, who teaches at the University of the Philippines, emphasized the distinction between an unlawful act and an act of war in international law. Not every unlawful act of a state is necessarily an act of war and formal hostilities between states. In international law, there are rules and jurisprudence on this issue, particularly international humanitarian law and laws of armed conflict. Amid rising tensions between the Philippines and China, it noted the country's constitutional mandate to renounce war as a national policy. Philippines' first recourse would always be to seek a peaceful diplomatic solution. That's why it is not easy for the Philippines to simply react to every incident as if it is an act of war and warrants full-scale hostility. Executive Secretary Lucas Bersamin said the government did not consider the Chinese Coast Guard confrontation an armed attack as stated in the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States. In what critics may see as a concession to China, Bersamin said Marcos approved a recommendation for the government to publicize the schedule when Navy personnel are deployed to transport food, water and other supplies to the Philippines' territorial outpost in the shoal. A small Philippine Navy contingent aboard a long-grounded dilapidated warship, the BRP Sierra Madre, has occupied 2nd Thomas Shoal since 1999, but China later deployed Coast Guard, PLA Navy, and suspected militia ships in a territorial standoff that has become increasingly volatile.